Hi, this is Jeff Zeig in the offices of the Milton Erickson Foundation. It's my pleasure, my privilege to do a reading to you. I'm reading to you three passages from the book that I did, The Epic Life of Milton Erickson, Professional Perspectives. These were professionals who knew Dr. Erickson during his long and distinguished career. And the three passages that I chose were to illustrate something about Dr. Erickson's perceptiveness, something about Dr. Erickson's ability to do strategic development, and something about Dr. Erickson's humanism. The first story was about one of the residents that Dr. Erickson had when he was working at the hospital in Eloise, Michigan. He was the director of training and research there, and there were psychiatric fellows who were under training with him. One of these was Dr. Fink. Dr. Fink relates that in 1945, Erickson visited Menninger Clinic to evaluate a patient. The doctors at the clinic had been working with the patient for 3 months, but were unable to determine if the man suffered from schizophrenia, so they asked Erickson for a diagnosis. Erickson saw the patient for less than a minute and diagnosed him as catatonic schizophrenic. Erickson said that to deduce this was rather simple. He had observed the man unconsciously moving his thumb and fingers and extending them in unusual ways. Erickson said that the man didn't know his body boundaries, which he took as an indicator of catatonic schizophrenia. Fink reported the physicians at the clinic attributed the diagnosis to the fact that Erickson, was highly intuitive when, in fact, he was a fantastic observer, which gets us into a second case. Erickson had an uncanny rapport with schizophrenic patients because at the Eloise Hospital, Fink said, Dr. Erickson assigned a patient to me. I examined this lady. I asked her about things. She got into a discussion about electricity, and it became a schizophrenic theme. She was paranoid about electricity. Erickson said to me, you asked her about electricity? Fink said, yes, I thought I should. Erickson said, did you ask her about electric city? A very subtle pun. And he walked up to the patient and said, would you mind telling Dr. Fink about electric city? And it was like a flower blossoming. Everything began rolling out because it was the right question in schizophrenic language. There was a third case, another case, a woman thought to be suffering from schizophrenia, and she mentioned 8 o'clock and then started mentioning the names of coffees that were popular at that time, Bocar, Maxwell House, Chase and Sanborn, but she blocked at San when she was saying Chase and Sanborn. Now, what did you get out of that? Erickson asked. I had a blank look on my face. Well, he said, now, Bocar, that might represent a place, and certainly 8 o'clock was a time. And so we had the social services investigate, and lo and behold, he was right on target, and this unearthed the precipitating cause of her psychosis. Erickson said, as far as the house goes, that it's related to a place. There was a house, there was a chase, which was a clandestine meeting, and by blocking at Bourne, as in Sanborn or Sunborn, seemed to be that she was unconsciously communicating something. As it turns out, the woman was from the Northeast. She'd been to a cabin in the mountains with a boyfriend on a weekend and became pregnant and gave birth to a son. So Fink credited Dr. Erickson for his career in psychiatry. Fink said that Erickson was a fantastically magnetic individual. He was a fantastic detective of the unconscious, non-conforming, non-conventional. He had a remarkable grasp of unconscious language. Now we move from the 1940s into the latter part of Dr. Erickson's career. These were related by a colleague and a friend, David Kaloff, and one of them speaks to Dr. Erickson's use of strategic development. Kaloff describes some individual sessions he had when he was learning from Dr. Erickson. He said, I was certainly struggling financially, and there was the expense of visiting Dr. Erickson. Kaloff said to Dr. Erickson, I'm having trouble controlling my expenditures. I've tried this and that and the other thing and wonder if perhaps with hypnosis, as Kaloff relates. Of course, buried beneath this riskless gambit was the wish that Dr. Erickson would somehow magically transform me. I might only have to dust myself off slightly, none the worse for wear, and begin my new life. At the time, I wore my hair past my shoulders. It'd never been a topic of conversation in the years I knew Dr. Erickson until then. After pouring out my story with all the appropriate affect, I sat back prepared to be held, carried to a new level of function and integration. I visibly reclined and cleared my throat, and just when I thought I would be carried off, Dr. Erickson screwed up his face quizzically and asked with utter sincerity, as though it was the most interesting thing in the world to him at that moment, "Why do you wear your hair so long?" His question broke my dysfunctional trance in an instant. My whole rehearsed story disappeared. I was unable to think clearly. I felt exposed. My quarrel with my father over the length of my hair suddenly took my mind off my problem. Desperate for a safe harbor, I dissociated. I must have shown telltale signs of trance in the moment because I was unable to garner my earlier story as a defense. I was unable to gather my former mind. I mumbled, stammered, and attempted to say a couple of words, but I couldn't intelligibly speak. I do know I felt a whirlwind of emotion in my gut as I struggled to make sense of his question, obviously attributing great importance to it, not wanting to be seen as not getting it. But before I could muster words into a sentence, Erickson urgently called for a visiting friend and psychiatrist, Marion Moore, to wheel him back to the main house. The office was in a guest house next to the main house. When I tried to speak again, Erickson looked away quickly, began to wheel himself out of the room. Erickson was in a wheelchair, not making eye contact and saying, "Think about it tonight, I'll see you again in the morning." Before he was out the door, Dr. Erickson said to Dr. Moore, "Quickly, Marion." He vanished from sight. David said, "I sat immobilized in the trance chair for a long time and finally left to go for dinner. The trance seemed to remain for the evening. I vividly dreamt, slept soundly, and woke up refreshed the next morning, somehow feeling lighter. The next day I was prepared with the rehearsed story of what I thought it meant that I wore my hair long, but before I could offer it, Erickson, with a mischievous, avuncular look, said to me kindly, as if it had been on his mind constantly since he last saw me, or as if no time had intervened, "David, I think it's wonderful that you spend money. I think it's wonderful that you spend money on books. And I think you should enjoy reading those books before you buy your new ones." Again, this is that stepwise way of speaking that Erickson was renowned for. "I think it's wonderful that you want to buy nice things for yourself. I think you should buy nice things for yourself. As a matter of fact, I think you should buy yourself a savings account." David said the idea was instantly delicious. Rather than seeing savings as deprivation, a have-not, I saw it as something I could have. Shortly after that, I found myself getting my first serious savings account. One more story, a story that reflects on Dr. Erickson's humanistic style and his way of orienting towards. In the book, this is called A Case of Mortality. David Kaloff again. "I remember one profoundly touching and moving experience. It happened near the end of Erickson's life and involved the death of a member of the seminar. The poignant juxtaposition of these two events, the student dying and Erickson's imminent death, made it an especially universal experience. Sometime in the summer of 1979, Dr. Erickson died in March of 80, I was visiting during a very busy teaching week. One of the young professionals in the teaching group had apparently waited for years to get an audience with Dr. Erickson. He was clearly tickled and delighted to be there, but he was in the terminal phase of cancer and was accompanied by a nurse attendant. You could see that he was dying, but you could also see his joy in finally being at a teaching session. On a hot afternoon, Erickson was in fine form. It was a scorcher of a day. Phoenix, the desert, it can be very hot. The room was crowded and hot and stuffy, and we'd been going on for 3 hours when at one point the young fellow finally interrupted Erickson and said somewhat impatiently, "Could we take a break?" Erickson hesitated for a moment and then said, "No, but you can." I was shocked at the force of Erickson's comment. A chill hung in the air as the group tensed. The teaching session ended about an hour later, and 2 hours after that, the young fellow died, remarkably at peace by report of his nurse. I believe there was a relationship between Erickson's comment and the man's peaceful death. The incident was oddly and wonderfully punctuated. About the time of the death, a freak rainstorm came up quickly and left just as quickly, removing the dust from the air and leaving everything drenched and refreshed. Maybe it was positive ions, but many members of the group reported having a sudden sense of peaceful joy at the time of the storm. The next day was just as memorable. Word of the young man's death spread quickly among the students in attendance. Erickson was having a painful day and started late. Dr. Moore mentioned to the group that he had conveyed the news to Dr. Erickson. We all wondered how he would deal with it. We had many mixed feelings from the previous day. About 2 hours later, Dr. Erickson was beaming when he was wheeled in his wheelchair into the room. He had a smile I can only describe as beatific. He wore one of his traditional string ties made of jade or amber in the form of Chinese character. Beaming, he looked around the room and made eye contact with each one of us, a rather shell-shocked motley crew. Erickson then gestured to his tie in an upbeat, grandfatherly tone, said to the group, "Do you know what this means?" We weren't in a mood to play 20 questions. Somebody ventured to guess, and Erickson said, "No. It means may your happiness multiply and multiply." With that, he began his teaching session with no mention of the death and spoke for hours without interruption. Only after we left at the end of the tiring day did it dawn on several of us that Erickson had not directly commented on death. I remember going to dinner, Kaloff speaking. Though tired, we were all feeling elated. It seemed rather strange that we were feeling so elated, given the important events of the previous day. We puzzled over it over dinner. We could not quite place our fingers on exactly what had happened. We were all feeling elated and shared a sense of peace and communion. It took us some time to realize that from Erickson's comment, "May your happiness multiply and multiply," he began telling the story of life. Stories involving pregnant women, then engaging tales of infancy, childhood and adolescence, young adulthood, parenthood, grandparenthood, old age, and finally death. This placed the untimely, for us, passing of our colleague in the cycle of natural life events. Having been taken through the cycle to its completion, Erickson gave us a parallel framework where we could work out a sense of completion with our deceased colleagues. In any event, it was a profound day. A few months later, I learned Erickson died, and in that instant, that day came back to me. As I reflected, I felt certain that Erickson must have had some control of when he chose to take his break, and the same peaceful feeling I had that day returned. Well, this is a book filled with stories that are sweet, inspirational, sharp with their message about what can be learned about the intricacies of human communication. And I invite you to take your turn at reading this book, as I've just taken mine, reading it to you and seeing the things that you can extract from the book that can add new substance, new meaning, new vitality to your life. This is Jeff Zeig in the offices of the Milton Erickson Foundation. Thank you so much.